Your translator is lying. The waitress whispered it into the millionaire CEO's ear, right in the middle of the restaurant, mid-negotiation. The contract, all in German, was about to be signed. Everything seemed perfectly set, but that one sentence changed everything. Nicolas Montenegro arrived at the restaurant a few minutes before his scheduled time, not because he was anxious, but because he liked to be in control. He'd always preferred to get to places before they filled up. It let him observe, get a feel for the atmosphere, size people up. The restaurant was high-end, quiet, the kind where everything looks too expensive to touch without care. For Nicolas, it was just a backdrop. What mattered was in the leather brief he carried in his right hand. He took a seat at the reserved table near the window. The view showed the city in motion, cars rushing by, people hurrying, big decisions being made in unseen places. He opened his brief calmly. The thick contract was right there, in German. It was a deal that had been debated for months, one that could take his company to a whole new level. Nicolas didn't speak German. He'd never needed to. He always relied on professionals for that. The translator was already there, a well-dressed man, relaxed posture, almost over-the-top confidence. He greeted Nicolas firmly, sat down without waiting for an invitation, and started talking before anyone even asked. He chatted about the traffic, about the city, about how demanding investors could be. Nicolas listened in silence. All that self-assurance didn't bother him. Quite the opposite, it seemed a sign of competence. "They'll be here any minute," the translator said. "Everything's aligned." Nicolas nodded, closed his brief, and rested his hands on the table. He liked clean, organized tables, free of clutter. For him, clarity started with the space around you. He ordered just water. The translator ordered wine. The waitress approached with discreet steps. Young, simple uniform, proper posture. She served the water, adjusted the glasses, and asked if they'd like anything else. Her voice was low, professional, almost neutral. Nicolas replied with a short nod. There was no need for anything more. Beatrice moved away unhurriedly. She was used to being just part of the furniture. She'd learned early that in places like this, the less you were noticed, the better. She observed everything without seeming present. She walked to another table, took orders, then went back to the counter. The investors arrived soon after. Formal greetings, handshakes, polite, restrained smiles. German quickly dominated the table. The translator naturally took on the role of intermediary, repeating what was said in German back in English. Nicolas listened intently, following the rhythm of the conversation. Everything seemed to be going as expected. Beatrice returned with the wine. She served the guests first, then Nicolas, and finally, the translator. As she leaned in to reach a glass, she caught loose words in German. Nothing complete, nothing clear, just fragments. She didn't react, just kept working. The conversation advanced. They spoke of deadlines, deliverables, commitments. The translator translated fluently, using a confident, sometimes overly assured, tone. Nicolas made brief notes. He didn't understand the original language, but he understood negotiations. He trusted the process. It had always worked that way. Beatrice passed the table again, collecting empty glasses. She heard another phrase in German, then another. They weren't difficult words. They were common, familiar, used in serious contexts. She felt a slight unease, but pushed the thought away. It wasn't her job to interpret other people's conversations. She went back to the counter and organized plates. The restaurant was full now, but Nicolas's table maintained its own kind of silence, a silence of importance. Everything there seemed calculated, measured, under control. Nicolas watched the investors, their contained gestures, their attentive gazes. There was no hostility or exaggerated enthusiasm. It was a professional agreement, nothing more. He liked that. Clear business, no drama. The translator kept talking, sometimes taking up too much space in the conversation. He interrupted, explained, summarized. Nicolas saw no problem. That was his job, to translate, adapt, facilitate. Beatrice returned to serve a dish. As she positioned the cutlery, she heard German again. This time, the phrase was too complete to ignore. It wasn't technical. It was a tone, a weight. She felt her body react before she even thought. Still, she kept her face neutral and moved away. She took a deep breath behind the counter. She tried to focus on her work. She didn't want to make up stories in her own head. How many times had she misunderstood things out of context? How many times had she been wrong? The conversation continued. The translator spoke naturally. The investors listened intently. Nicolas remained calm, confident. Nothing indicated any problem. Beatrice observed from a distance, not out of curiosity, but habit. She'd grown up in a home where German wasn't used for trivialities. It always came out when something serious needed to be said. That had stayed with her, even without her realizing it. At the table, Nicholas closed his brief for an instant, listening intently to one of the investors. The translator translated quickly. Nicholas nodded. Everything seemed in order. Beatrice felt the unease return, stronger this time. Still, she did nothing. It wasn't the right time. Maybe it never would be. The restaurant kept humming. Plates came and went. Side conversations drifted. But that table remained in an invisible spotlight. An important contract, important people, important decisions. Nicholas suspected nothing. He trusted the process. He trusted the translator. He trusted his own experience. Beatrice remained there, almost invisible, doing her job, hearing fragments, holding on to feelings, not yet knowing that in that very place, at another time, everything would change. For now, nothing was happening, and precisely because of that, everything was still yet to happen. Beatrice crossed the dining room with a tray balanced on her left arm. Hot dishes, neatly aligned glasses, measured steps. She'd learned early to move without taking up space in the restaurant. It made a difference. Those who drew too much attention often got heard, and being heard there was rarely a good thing. Nicholas's table remained untouched. Same setup, same people. The translator spoke non-stop, leaning forward as if driving the conversation. The investors listened intently. Nicholas maintained his firm posture, arms resting on the table, direct gaze. He seemed comfortable, in charge of the situation. Beatrice served one of the dishes and moved away. She didn't linger, never did. But 2 steps away, she heard a phrase in German escape louder than normal. Not the whole thing, just the beginning. Enough to recognize the tone. She didn't react. She continued to the counter, jotted down another order, then returned to the dining room. The restaurant was full, laughter at some tables, loud conversations at others, but that table remained isolated, as if surrounded by an invisible bubble. The translator chuckled, spoke fast, translated fast. Beatrice passed again, this time with water. As she approached, she heard another phrase in German, longer this time. The investor spoke calmly. The tone wasn't light. The translator responded in English, with words that were too soft. Beatrice felt a slight clench in her chest. She paused for half a second, just long enough to properly place the glass on the table. No one noticed. She returned to the service area, grabbed a clean cloth, and wiped a surface that was already clean. She needed to keep her hands busy. When she was a child, she'd sit on the kitchen floor while her grandmother stirred coffee on the stove. Her great-grandmother would be at the table, hands crossed, looking out the window. When they started speaking in German, Beatrice knew it wasn't time to play. She didn't need to understand everything, just the way it sounded. The language came out harder, the phrases were short, the silences long. In the restaurant, the sound was the same. Beatrice returned to the dining room with another order, passing near the table again. The translator interrupted the investor mid-sentence. He translated something fast, shortened. Nicholas made a brief note on his paper. She felt the unease grow, but kept moving. A colleague crossed paths with her in the corridor. "Big table today," she commented quietly. Beatrice nodded. "Important client, seems like it." The colleague shrugged and moved on. For her, it was just another demanding table. For Beatrice, it wasn't anymore. She approached again, this time to collect empty plates. The investor was speaking German, using a word Beatrice knew well. It wasn't rare, it was common at home. It always came up when someone was warning about risk. The translator translated it as if it were just a technical detail. Beatrice felt her stomach churn. She didn't think about the contract, didn't think about money. She thought about her grandmother, saying that word never came alone. It always carried consequences. She collected the plates carefully. One of the investors watched her for an instant. Beatrice kept her face neutral. She didn't look away, didn't smile, showed nothing. She returned to the counter. The manager rushed past her. "Keep an eye on that table," he said. "Can't have any mistakes, eh?" "Yes," Beatrice replied. "Error?" The word echoed. She watched from afar. The translator was gesticulating more now. He spoke loudly, laughed. Nicholas remained serious, listening, sometimes asking questions. The translator answered too quickly. Another German phrase crossed the dining room. This time, Beatrice recognized 2 words in a row. The tone didn't match the translator's smile. She clenched the cloth in her hands. When she was little, Her great-grandmother used to say certain things in German precisely so the kids wouldn't understand, but Beatrice understood enough, always had. She'd never thought it important, until now. She passed the table one more time, serving coffee. The investor spoke slowly. The translator translated quickly. Nicholas nodded. Beatrice almost stumbled as she moved away. She regained her balance before anyone noticed. Her heart raced, not from fear of falling, from something else. She leaned for a moment near the kitchen. The clatter of dishes helped to disguise her thoughts. She didn't want to get involved, didn't want to cause trouble. She knew how things worked. People like her weren't asked for their opinions, but this wasn't an opinion. The translator made a joke. The investors smiled faintly. Nicholas didn't smile. Beatrice returned to the dining room. The conversation continued. The contract remained open on the table, pens aligned, everything ready to proceed. She heard another phrase. This time there was no doubt. The tone was one of warning. The translator translated it, as if it were a mere formality. Beatrice felt her face flush, looked around. No one seemed to notice anything. To everyone there, that language was just foreign noise. For her, it was a warning. She thought of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, how they had never studied that language, but knew how to use it at the right times. She thought about how they had never told her it could ever be useful for anything. Beatrice felt a weight on her shoulders. She still didn't know what she would do. Maybe she wouldn't do anything. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the feeling wouldn't go away. She remained there, serving, cleaning, listening. The language no one else seemed to hear kept speaking, and Beatrice kept listening. Beatrice stopped near the kitchen door when she heard the word again. This time it came clear, whole, no doubt about it. The investor spoke carefully, as if measuring each syllable. The translator responded too quickly. She didn't need to translate word for word. The meaning came with it. That wasn't a technical detail. It was a condition, a risk. It was something that, at home, never went unaddressed. The translator chuckled. Beatrice felt her stomach clench. She returned to the counter and pretended to organize orders. Her mind, however, was far away. For the first time since she'd started working at that restaurant, she couldn't ignore what she was hearing, not out of curiosity, but because she now understood enough to know it wasn't irrelevant. The investor spoke again, using another familiar word. It wasn't complicated. It was common. It always came up when someone spoke of loss, of limits, of something that couldn't be reversed later. The translator translated it as if it were flexible. Beatrice pressed her fingers against the counter. She remembered her grandmother saying in German that certain things only seem small until they've gone too far. She remembered her great-grandmother banging her hand on the table when someone tried to soften something too serious. In the restaurant, no one was banging on tables. The translator was speaking loudly now, confidently, interrupting the investors naturally. He was taking the lead in the conversation. Nicholas listened. Sometimes he'd frown, but he remained attentive. Beatrice passed the table again, collecting napkins. The translator shot her a quick, impatient glance, as if her presence was a hindrance. He didn't say anything, just kept talking. She heard another phrase, longer. This time there was absolutely no doubt. That defined responsibility, defined control, defined who would lose out if something went wrong. The translator translated it as if it were just a legal formality. Beatrice felt her heart race. Now it wasn't just a feeling, not just a memory, it was understanding. She knew she didn't master the language, knew she didn't know technical terms, but she also knew when someone was downplaying something that shouldn't be downplayed. She returned to the kitchen with short steps, leaning near the sink. The sound of the water helped hide the silence in her head. She thought about leaving, thought about asking to switch sections. She thought about pretending she hadn't heard anything. She thought about her job. She needed that job, needed the shift, needed the wages. She couldn't afford to cause trouble with an important client. She couldn't get involved in a conversation that wasn't hers. The manager passed by her. "Stay sharp," he said. "They'll probably ask for more wine?" "Yes," Beatrice replied. She returned to the dining room with the bottle. As she approached, she heard the investor say something in German, now with a firmer tone. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a warning. The translator translated with a smile. Nicholas asked a short question. The translator answered without consulting the investors. Beatrice noticed. That didn't escape her attention. She served the wine. The translator didn't even thank her, just kept talking. Beatrice moved away and felt a mix of fear and indignation. Not for herself, but for what was happening right there in front of everyone, without anyone noticing. She started putting the pieces of the puzzle together. She didn't know details, didn't know numbers, but she knew something important was being diluted, that a heavy clause was being presented as simple, that someone was driving that conversation more than they should have been. The translator. He moved like he owned the table, correcting, adjusting, cutting off speeches, choosing what to translate and how to translate, and he did it with too much confidence. Beatrice remembered how at home, German was never used to deceive. It was used to warn, to protect, to prevent mistakes. Here, it was being used the opposite way. She felt an urge to go to the table, felt an urge to say something, but the image of the manager, of her job, of her wages, came right with it. Fear set in quickly. She was a nobody there. Nicholas was the CEO. The investors were important foreigners. The translator was the hired professional. She was just the waitress. Who would believe her? She heard one more sentence. This time, she didn't even have to think. That changed everything. The translator translated vaguely, almost generically. Beatrice felt a chill down her spine. She moved away from the table and went to the back of the dining room. She leaned against the wall for a moment, pretending to observe another table. Her heart was pounding. She didn't yet know what she would do, but she knew that if she stayed silent, something serious would be decided there without the full truth being on the table. The conversation was heading towards a close. The translator began talking about next steps, signing, timelines. Beatrice took a deep breath. She had no proof, no authority, no place in that conversation. She only had what she'd heard, and now she knew exactly what it meant. The table was overly organized, papers aligned, pens carefully positioned, glasses full again. The translator spoke as if he were already wrapping things up. His tone was that of someone steering towards the finish line. Beatrice noticed before any words were said. The investor spoke in German one more time, without beating around the bush. It was no longer a warning, it was a statement of fact. The kind of phrase that, at home, was followed by silence. The translator translated quickly, cutting the weight of the phrase in half. Nicholas nodded. That was enough. Beatrice felt her body react before her head decided. One step, then another. Her tray was light, just empty cups. She walked towards the table, as she did countless times a day. No different gesture, no rush. The translator kept talking. She approached Nicholas from his side, leaned in just enough to reach the table, as if to clear something. The smell of coffee still lingered. The restaurant's usual hum continued. No one was paying attention. Beatrice got close enough for only him to hear. Your translator is lying. She didn't explain, didn't repeat, didn't raise her voice, didn't wait for a reply. She straightened up, collected the cups, and walked away. The world didn't stop. The restaurant kept running. Someone laughed at another table. A waiter rushed past behind her. Nothing changed for an outside observer. But at that table, the air felt different. Nicholas didn't move immediately, didn't look at Beatrice, didn't react. He just stayed still for a fraction longer than normal. The translator kept talking, oblivious. Beatrice felt her legs tremble as she turned her back. She walked to the counter with measured steps. Her hands were cold. Her heart was beating too fast for the rhythm of the room. She knew what she had just done. She also knew there was no turning back. The translator finished his sentence and smiled. He expected agreement. Nicholas took a moment to respond. He closed his brief calmly. Not completely, just enough to interrupt the flow. Repeat that, he said in English. The translator blinked, surprised. Of course, he said, adjusting his posture. I was explaining that. Repeat what he said, Nicholas interrupted, pointing to the investor. The investor spoke again in German, slowly. The translator translated. Nicholas listened without writing anything. He just watched. From the counter, Beatrice followed everything. She pretended to wipe a glass. She didn't look directly at the table, but she listened to every shift in tone. The translator started to justify himself more than before. He added words, adjusted phrases. Nicholas listened in silence. Again, he demanded. Now, in simple German, learned from old travels. A single word, a test, the investor replied. The translator translated too quickly. Nicholas raised his eyes for the first time, not to Beatrice, but to the translator. Let's take it slow, he said. No rush. The translator nodded, but his smile was gone. He ran a hand over his collar, took a sip of wine, and spoke less. Beatrice felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. Now it was a waiting game. There was nothing more she could do, no point regretting it. She moved to the back of the dining room when the manager approached. What did you say over there? He asked quietly. Beatrice swallowed hard. Nothing much, she replied. Just advised about the coffee. The manager frowned, suspicious, but didn't press. The table was too important to cause a scene. The translator was speaking more carefully now. The investors exchanged brief glances. Nicholas asked objective questions, one at a time. Beatrice watched from afar, feeling time stretch. She knew she could be fired that very night. She knew she could be called in, questioned, exposed. She knew perhaps no one would believe her. Even so, she didn't regret it. The translator tried to end the conversation more than once, speaking of timelines, of signing. Nicholas closed his brief completely. "Let's leave it for another day," he said. The translator's eyes widened. "But everything's set," he responded quickly. "It's just a formality now." "No," Nicholas said, dryly. "It's not." The silence that followed was short, but heavy. The investors exchanged glances. The translator opened his mouth to speak, and closed it again. Beatrice felt the air thicken. Nicholas stood up calmly, thanked the investors, apologized for the postponement, and said he'd be in touch. The translator tried to follow. Nicholas didn't respond. Beatrice cleared the table after they'd left. Her hands trembled less now. The fear was still there, but something different was mixed with it. Awareness. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she'd be called in, didn't know if she'd lose her job. She only knew that in that moment, she had done what needed to be done. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm. Other tables, other orders, just another night. But for Beatrice, that sentence still echoed, short, direct, irreversible, and everything from then on began to change. Nicholas didn't go straight home that night. He left the restaurant as he always left important places, without showing haste, without giving explanations, without looking back. He greeted the investors with restrained politeness, ignored the translator when he tried to approach again, and got into his car with the same neutral face he always wore. But inside, something felt off. The drive to the office was silent. No calls, no music, just the constant hum of the engine and the thought that kept returning to the same point. The low, firm voice, without a tremor, "Your translator is lying." It wasn't the content of the sentence that bothered him most. It was the sheer lack of fuss about it. There was no plea, no drama, no attempt to convince him, just a warning. Dry, precise, like someone who knows they won't be heard, but speaks anyway. Nicholas parked in his private spot and went up alone. The building was almost empty, few lights on, the kind of silence that only exists after important decisions have been postponed. He entered his own office. He tossed his jacket onto a chair and stood for a few seconds, looking at the table. The contract was still there. He didn't open it immediately. He sat down, crossed his hands, and took a deep breath. For years, Nicholas had trusted two things above all: numbers and technical people. He'd always believed that danger came from emotions, not from well-trained professionals, and the translator was exactly that. Experienced, highly recommended, too self-assured, far too self-assured. The memory of the restaurant returned with greater clarity now. The simple questions, the overly long answers, the rush to drive the conversation, the visible annoyance when Nicholas asked for a clause to be repeated. Nothing glaring, nothing obvious, but enough to leave a crack. He turned on his computer and opened the contract. This time not to progress, but to scrutinize. He read it calmly. He didn't understand technical German, but he understood structure, sequence, rhythm, and something there seemed out of alignment, not in the text, but in its presentation. He picked up the phone. "Call legal first thing tomorrow," he told his assistant in a neutral tone. "I want an independent, discreet analysis of the contract. No fuss." "Any specific urgency?" she asked. "Just for precision." "Just accuracy," he replied. "No interference." He hung up. The next morning, he arrived earlier than usual. The company was still waking up when he was already sitting, reviewing old emails related to the negotiation. Nothing jumped out, no obvious errors, the kind of trap that only works because it looks clean. Legal came in a little later. "I want you to review this as if you knew nothing," Nicholas said, pushing the contract across the table. "And I want a parallel technical translation, line by line." "Today?" the lawyer asked. "No rush," Nicholas replied, "but no sloppiness." The lawyer nodded and left. The day moved at a strange pace. Nicholas attended meetings, signed minor documents, answered messages, but his thoughts didn't stray, not from the contract, but from the waitress. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that the human brain looks for patterns where none exist, that it made no sense for a young woman serving tables to identify something that had passed muster with investors and professionals. And yet, The uneasiness remained. Late that afternoon, the phone rang. "Mr. Nicholas," said the lawyer's voice, more restrained than usual. "We're still analyzing, but there's something I need to tell you." Nicholas straightened in his chair. "Go on. There's a clause that doesn't quite match the way it was presented," he explained. "Nothing explicit, but its practical effect is different from what was verbally outlined." The silence on the other end of the line stretched. "Different how?" Nicholas asked. "In case of operational disagreement," the lawyer said, "decisional control shifts hands for a determined period." Nicholas closed his eyes for a second. "Was this mentioned?" he asked. "Not in the way it's written," the lawyer replied. "And if applied, it creates significant strategic damage." Nicholas didn't respond immediately. "Continue," he said at last. "We're requesting a second external translation," the lawyer added. "But this already raises a red flag." Nicholas hung up without thanking him. He stood, looking out at the city from the window. Lights were beginning to flicker on below, one by one. He felt something rare, not anger, but a chill. The phrase returned now with a different weight. "Your translator is lying." It was no longer a loose warning, it was a starting point. He picked up the contract again, not with haste, not with anxiety, but with method, the same method that had brought him this far. He didn't yet know the size of the trap, didn't know who was involved, didn't know how far it went, but he knew one thing. Someone had tried to manipulate him, and someone, too improbable to ignore, had seen it first. Nicholas leaned back in his chair for 2 days. That was the time he gave himself. 2 days to be certain, to confirm, to understand. And all the while, a silent, nagging question hammered at him. How many times had he trusted loud voices and ignored those who spoke softly? The second day began with silence. No calls from the investors, no messages from the translator, no attempts at pressure. The kind of calm that doesn't reassure, but merely conceals. Nicholas arrived early, again, earlier than any other executive, not out of anxiety, but method. He knew that important decisions don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves little by little. Legal was already in the building. "We've received the external translation," the lawyer said as soon as Nicholas entered the office. "Independent, technical, no contact with any of the involved parties." "And?" Nicholas asked, cutting straight to it. The lawyer opened his brief carefully. There was no dramatization in his gestures. That, in itself, was a sign. "The contract isn't illegal," he began. "It's worse than that. It's ingenious." Nicholas remained silent. "The clauses are drafted to appear balanced," the lawyer continued. "But in practice, they transfer decision-making power at critical moments. Nothing immediate, nothing explicit, only when it's already too late." "Was this mentioned at the table?" Nicholas asked. "No," the lawyer replied. "It was softened, adjusted. Some key words were omitted in the oral translation." Nicholas rested his elbows on the table. "Confirm," he said, "that the verbal translation was different from the original text." The lawyer nodded, specifically at strategic points. "Yes." Nicholas closed his brief. There was no outburst, no visible surprise, just confirmation. "I want everything documented," he said, line by line, a comparative analysis. "And I want to know how long this translator has been working with that group." "We're already looking into it," the lawyer responded. "There's a pattern." The word hung in the air. A pattern. Nicholas left the office without another word. He walked down the long corporate corridor, ignoring automatic greetings. His mind worked in layers, as it always did during real crises. It wasn't just a compromised contract, it was manipulated trust. It was someone betting he wouldn't ask too many questions, and, more importantly, it was someone counting on the silence of those without a voice. In the early afternoon, he called the translator. "I want to clarify a few points," he said on the phone. "First thing tomorrow." The reply came too quickly. "Of course, Mr. Nicholas. I'm at your disposal." Assured, comfortable, the same tone as always. Nicholas hung up. He didn't need to confront him yet. The truth was already clear. The next step wasn't to accuse, it was to observe. Meanwhile, Beatrice kept working. The restaurant was full that day. Business lunches, controlled laughter, important conversations in low tones. Beatrice moved between tables as always, attentive, discreet, invisible when she needed to be. But inside, her body was on alert. Since the day of the contract table, nothing had happened. No telling off, no call, no warning. The silence now felt heavy. She wondered if she'd done the right thing, if she'd overreacted, if she'd misinterpreted. Her fear wasn't of the millionaire, it was of the aftermath. She knew places like this. She knew how mistakes weren't announced. They were punished in silence. She served coffees, collected plates, avoided looking at the table where it had all begun. When her shift ended, she left quickly, as usual. Nicholas watched from afar. He hadn't gone to the restaurant that day by chance. He sat at a discreet table, ordered something simple, and paid more attention to the people than to the environment. He saw Beatrice working, her restrained manner, her excessive care, her body always a step behind, as if she didn't want to occupy space. Nothing about her sought attention. And yet, it was she who had noticed what an entire room hadn't. He didn't call out to her, didn't wave, didn't approach. Not yet. At the end of the day, he returned to the office with another piece of the puzzle in place. The confirmation came in the early evening. Legal sent the final report. There was no longer any doubt. The translator had lied, not about everything, not crudely, but enough to steer decisions, to buy time, to create dependence, to favor interests that weren't Nicholas's. Nicholas read the entire document without skipping a line. Then he closed the file. He felt no relief. He felt something heavier. The realization that if he had signed that night, he wouldn't have noticed the error until it was too late, and that if it hadn't been interrupted, no one would have taken responsibility. No one, except the young woman who had nothing to gain by speaking up. He leaned back in his chair. 2 days. 2 days had been enough to confirm everything. Now, there were choices. The first would be to deal with the translator. The second, more delicate, would be to decide what to do with Beatrice. Not as an impulsive reward, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real consequence. He didn't want to create a nice story. He wanted to correct a structural flaw. He looked out at the city. The fraud was proven, the risk contained, control recovered. But what bothered him most wasn't the averted loss. It was the question that now wouldn't leave his head. How many decisions had he made throughout his life, based only on who spoke the loudest? The next day, Beatrice was called in mid-shift. There was no explanation, just a discreet request from the manager, in a tone too neutral to be reassuring. "They want to speak with you out front." She felt her stomach drop, washed her hands more carefully than usual, adjusted her apron, and took a deep breath. She thought of everything she might have done wrong in the past few days, thought of the warning, thought of the silence that followed, thought she might have overstepped. Nicholas was waiting outside the restaurant, leaning against his car, away from the tables. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple shirt with sleeves rolled up. Still, his posture left no doubt. Beatrice recognized him instantly. She stopped a few steps away. "You wanted to speak with me, sir?" she asked in a low voice. Nicholas nodded. "Oh, yes," he replied. "If you have a few minutes." She nodded too. She didn't ask why, didn't apologize. Just stood there waiting. "I want to start by saying one thing," he said. "You're not in any trouble." Beatrice breathed a little easier, but didn't relax. "I requested an independent verification of the contract," Nicholas continued. "It took 2 days, and it confirmed what you said." Her eyes widened. She didn't know how to respond. "The translator lied," he stated, without mincing words. The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice started, but stopped. "I wasn't absolutely sure. It just sounded wrong." "It was wrong," Nicholas affirmed. "And it wasn't obvious." She lowered her eyes. "I was scared to speak up," she confessed. "I didn't think anyone would listen to me." "Yet you spoke," he replied. Beatrice shrugged, uncomfortable. "I didn't think about anything after that," she said. "I just thought that if it went wrong, at least I'd be able to sleep. If I didn't speak up, I wouldn't." Nicholas was silent for a few seconds before asking, "How did you learn German?" Beatrice hesitated. The question didn't sound accusatory, it sounded curious. "At home," she replied. "With my grandmother and great-grandmother." He looked at her attentively. "Were they German?" he asked. "Descendants," Beatrice explained. "My great-grandmother spoke it almost all the time. My grandmother mixed it with English, but when things got serious, she'd switch languages." She smiled faintly, without realizing it. "When it was a problem," she continued, "when there was a difficult decision, when someone was sick, they'd speak German." "So you grew up hearing it?" Nicholas said. "Yes," she replied. "Not as a study, but just living with it." She paused. "I never thought it would be useful. I always thought it was just family stuff." Nicholas felt something clench in his chest. It wasn't uncontrolled emotion, it was belated recognition. "You apologized that day," he commented, "for getting involved." Beatrice nodded. "It wasn't my place," she said. "I served tables, not contracts." "Who told you that?" Nicholas asked. She fell silent. "Life," she replied after a few seconds. Nicholas took a deep breath. "You know what bothered me most about all this?" he said. "It wasn't the attempted fraud. It was realizing that no one at that table was prepared to listen to someone like you. Beatriz didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how. "I came back here today," he continued, "because I needed to understand if what you did was by chance or by character." She lifted her gaze. "It wasn't courage," she said. "It was discomfort." Nicholas nodded slowly. "That's what almost everyone runs away from," he responded. They stood in silence for a few seconds. The distant city hum filled the space between them. "I don't want you to feel indebted," Nicholas said at last. "Nor do I want this to become a nice story to tell." "I don't want that," Beatriz replied quickly. "I just did what I thought was right." "I know," he said, "and that's why I'm here." He got straight to the point. "I want to offer you an opportunity," he said. "Not now, not as a prize, but as a path." She frowned. "What kind of opportunity?" she asked. "An entry-level position in my company," he replied. "Nothing high-ranking, nothing symbolic, real work. And along with that, paid studies, languages, training, whatever you choose to develop." Beatriz took a moment to respond. "I don't have a university degree," she said, "or a resume." "You have an ear," Nicholas replied, "and attention. The rest can be built." She took a deep breath. "What if I say no?" she asked. "You continue your life," he answered. "No punishment, no obligation. But I'd prefer you say yes." Beatriz looked at the ground, thought of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, thought of how many times she'd believed that what she carried held no value. "I accept," she said at last, "but not out of gratitude." Nicholas smiled faintly. "That's the only right way to accept," he replied. She held out her hand. He shook it. Nothing was announced. Nothing was promised beyond what was possible. When Beatriz returned inside the restaurant, her shift seemed the same. The tables identical, the clients indifferent. But she wasn't the same anymore, and neither was Nicholas. Nicholas didn't announce anything. He didn't call the press, didn't issue an internal memo, didn't turn what happened into a corporate example. For him, it wasn't a victory, it was a course correction. The translator was quietly let go. No scene, no public humiliation, just a short email, suspended contracts, revoked access, the kind of exit that doesn't make headlines, but closes cycles. The German investors accepted the pause. The independent verification had changed the tone of conversations. The contract was rewritten, clearer, fairer, less comfortable for anyone trying to pull strings in the dark. Nicholas returned to his routine without a fuss, but something within him hadn't returned to its old place. In the following days, he started observing more, not in search of errors, but of silences. He began to notice who entered and left unseen, who spoke softly, who was interrupted, who apologized too much. It was a new, persistent discomfort. Beatriz started at the company 2 weeks later. No symbolic title, no announcement. A simple administrative role, close to the flow of documents, where information passed through, where small decisions began. On her first day, she arrived too early. She sat in reception a few minutes before her start time, backpack on her lap, a contained posture, an attentive gaze, as always. When she was called, she stood up too quickly. "Good morning," she said upon entering. Nicholas was standing next to the table. "Good morning," he replied. "Make yourself at home." She didn't. She only sat when he indicated. Her body still carried the habit of not occupying space. "This isn't a favor," he said, cutting to the chase. "It's a beginning. You'll make mistakes, you'll learn, and no one will spare you from that." "I don't expect to be spared," Beatriz replied. Nicholas nodded. "Good." She started without ceremony, learned quickly, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She observed before speaking. When she did speak, she was precise. Some found it strange. "Who is she?" they'd ask. "New," was the reply. Just that. Nicholas made a point of not interfering. He didn't follow her closely, didn't praise her publicly, didn't protect her. He observed from a distance. Beatriz didn't want to be an exception. She wanted to be capable. In the evenings, she studied formal German, technical English, concepts she'd only heard from afar before. For the first time, she felt that what she'd carried since childhood wasn't a strange detail. It was a foundation. It wasn't easy. There were days when she thought of giving up, when she felt out of place, too small for that environment. But she always remembered the moment in the restaurant, the silence after her sentence, the weight a quiet voice can carry. Nicholas also changed, without announcing it. He started requesting dual translations, listening less to prepared presentations and more to simple questions, becoming suspicious of excessive confidence. He didn't become gentler, he became more attentive. One afternoon, he crossed paths with Beatriz in the corridor. She was carrying a stack of documents, too focused to notice his presence. "Beatriz," he called. She stopped immediately. "Yes? How's it going?" he asked. She thought before answering. "Hard," she said, "but fair." He nodded. "That's the best kind of start," he replied. She moved on. He stayed. It wasn't gratitude he saw in her. It was responsibility. Something rare. Something he himself had almost lost over the years. Weeks later, the contract was finally signed. This time without rush, without celebration, just certainty. Nicholas held the pen for a second before signing, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. He knew exactly where he was treading. When he finished, he closed his brief and stood up. He didn't think about the averted loss. He thought about the restaurant table, the young woman who had nothing to gain, and how much he'd almost lost by only trusting those who spoke the loudest. That night, as he left the building, he saw Beatrice crossing the street, backpack on her back, quick steps, tired but resolute. She didn't see him, and that was good, because that choice was never about recognition. It was about listening and about the kind of leader he decided to be from then on. Sometimes, the biggest lie isn't written in any clause. It hides in the way we learn to listen, or rather, in the way we choose not to listen. At that table, there was everything power usually demands. Experienced executives, attentive investors, a translator too confident to be questioned. Everything seemed under control, but danger doesn't usually present itself with a fanfare. It comes disguised as normality, as excessive confidence, as a rush to conclude. And it was precisely there, where everyone felt prepared, that no one perceived the error. No one, except the one who had no place at the table. Beatrice wasn't there to offer an opinion, wasn't there to negotiate, wasn't there to be heard. She was there to serve. And perhaps because of that, she heard better. She didn't just hear isolated words. She heard the tone, the weight, the subtle omissions that only someone who grew up hearing that language in difficult moments could recognize. While everyone trusted the correct translation, she perceived what wasn't being said. And even knowing she could lose her job, even knowing no one would believe her, even knowing that wasn't her place, she spoke, without theatrics, without long explanations, without trying to convince. She spoke because silence, for her, would cost more. Nicholas had spent his whole life believing that leadership came from technical preparation, from a resume, from a strong presence, and that was never a lie. But that night he learned something no executive training teaches. Authority doesn't guarantee vision, and the louder someone speaks, the easier it is to ignore those who speak softly. The contract was almost signed, the trap almost worked, not due to incompetence, but to habit. The habit of always listening to the same people, of trusting the same voices, of presuming that talent goes hand in hand with status. When the truth came out, Nicholas could have moved on as if nothing had happened. He could have treated it all as luck or as a minor anomaly. But he chose to stop. He chose to review not just a contract, but his very way of seeing the people around him, because he realized something uncomfortable. How many important decisions had he made, ignoring those who seemed irrelevant? How many opportunities had he missed, because no one taught him to listen outside of hierarchy? This story isn't about a corrupt translator, nor about a millionaire CEO. It's about attention, about the hidden value in those who observe in silence, in those who don't interrupt, in those who learn without knowing why, and about how much the world loses when it only respects those who speak loudly. In the end, Beatrice didn't get an opportunity because she saved a contract. She got it because someone, for the first time, decided to look beyond the role she occupied. And Nicholas didn't become a better man by correcting a financial error. He changed because he learned something harder. The danger isn't making a mistake. It's making a mistake without ever hearing someone who tried to warn you. And now I want to ask you, if you were in Nicholas's shoes, would you have listened to that waitress? Or would you have trusted once again only those who seemed prepared? And if you were in Beatrice's shoes, would you have had the courage to speak up, even knowing you could lose everything for it? Tell me in the comments what the biggest lesson this story left you with. I'd love to read your answer. Also, tell me where you're tuning in from. If this story made you reflect, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because here you'll find stories that aren't just for listening, but for thinking. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this today. Thanks for sticking around until the end. See you in the next story.